From WFIU in Bloomington, Indiana, this is Earth Eats, and I'm Kate Young.
In the first Trump administration, about 350,000 people from Central America or Mexico were given these H-2A visas to come in temporarily with labor contractors. And many of them seem to have overstayed their visa because their labor is needed. We can't pick the crops in this country without them.
This week on the show, we welcome back geographer Elizabeth Cullen Dunn. She's the director of the Center for Refugee Studies at Indiana University, and we'll talk with her about how changes in federal policy, especially around immigration, affect our food system, including prices at the grocery store. Stay with us. Support for Earth Eats comes from Mallard-Grodner Attorneys, providing legal services to clients and the community. Mallard-Grodner Attorneys, understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. On the web at lawmg.com. Thanks for listening to Earth Eats. I'm Kate Young. With a new administration at the federal level, many changes and challenges to our food system are looming on the horizon, with uncertainty being the only thing we can count on at this point. Alexis Carvajal is here to start us off with updates from Harvest Public Media.
Billions of dollars for conservation and rural energy projects have been put on ice during a sweeping review by the USDA. Harvest Public Media's Rachel Kramer reports.
The American Soybean Association, National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, and other groups are urging the new administration to resume payments to farmers and grant recipients under contracts. Mike Lavender is the policy director for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. He says delayed reimbursements for farmers creates financial burdens. It can also dampen conservation practices later this year.
At this time of year for farmers and ranchers, they're planning for the work ahead, and the uncertainty that has been created by the executive orders and the broader freeze is creating a lot of pain and confusion.
Federal judges have ruled that the Trump administration did not have authority to block funding that was appropriated by Congress. The legal challenges are ongoing. I'm Rachel Kramer, Harvest Public Media.
17 university labs that research food and agriculture have stopped work after President Donald Trump froze the U.S. Agency for International Development last month, also known as USAID. As Harvest Public Media's Jim Meadows reports, now the programs, many housed at Midwest universities, are in limbo.
The Feed the Future Innovation Labs concentrate on improving agriculture and food security both abroad and in the U.S. One of those labs, the University of Illinois' Soybean Innovation Lab, laid off 30 employees after USAID shuttered. University of Missouri professor Carrie Clark was doing research with that lab.
So we've just basically, in the wink of an eye, shut down massive amounts of research that would benefit farmers, not only in the United States, but across the world.
Clark says the Soybean Innovation Lab researched a plant disease called soy rust, which exists in the U.S., and how to grow soybeans in drought conditions. Employees at many other innovation labs around the Midwest remain, but officials say that could change. I'm Jim Meadows, Harvest Public Media.
Harvest Public Media is a collaboration of public media newsrooms in the Midwest and Great Plains. Find more at harvestpublicmedia.org. For Earth Eats News, I'm Alexis Carvajal.
If there's one thing I've learned as the host and producer of Earth Eats, it's that our food system is complex, multifaceted, and intertwined with many larger systems, and smaller ones for that matter. Changes that happen in politics, the economy, the climate, and even trends in pop culture can have an effect on how food is grown, how it's processed, and how it's consumed. Our guest today has been on the show before. Her work sheds light on some of those interconnections and she's really good at helping us understand context and some of the ripple effects in our food system that can come from even one policy shift.
I'm Elizabeth Cullen Dunn. I am professor of geography at Indiana University, and I'm also the director of the Center for Refugee Studies. The Center for Refugee Studies is interested in all forms of forced migration. So forced migration is people who are forced out of their homes by conflict or by disaster and who are now in problematic situations in the world immigration system. So we're interested in asylum seekers. We're interested in people who have formal refugee status. We're interested in people who have to move without documentation because they are forced to move. So we think we cover a wide array of people, and we're interested both in the things in their home countries that force them to move, and we're interested in their reception in host countries. We also do a lot of work on humanitarian aid.
Thanks so much for being here on Earth Eats. We've definitely had you before as a guest, and you always shed a lot of insight into these issues and how they affect our food system. So I would like to start with just talking a little bit about the refugee admission program, sort of as it did exist until...
Well, and still exists because technically it's on pause. So one of the benefits of the U.S. refugee admissions program has been that it's part of the United States' commitment to upholding human rights around the world. And we have been willing to step in and help people whose human rights have been deeply, profoundly violated. And I think that that is an important part of moral leadership in the global political economy today. The U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program is run through the Department of State and the Department of Homeland Security. And it is a program which comes under the aegis of the 1980 Refugee Act, which allows the President of the United States to set the cap on the number of admissions. So the number of people who come in is set by the President. And these are people who have been referred to that program by the United Nations. They are people who generally have been in refugee camps in a second country for many years. And the process for coming here is really long. It takes 2 to 3 years. And it involves background checks by 8 federal agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of State. There are other background checks that go on, medical checks so that everyone is healthy coming in, or if they're here on for a medical reason, their medical condition is well known and well documented and not communicable. And they are interviewed multiple times by people who work for the U.S. government and who are doing security checks. So refugees are the most vetted visitors to the United States. There is no other class of people who receives as much security background checking as refugees. So the number of them who come in a given year has varied dramatically over time. Under the Obama administration, it was about 100,000 people a year. That dropped significantly under the first Trump administration when it went down to a low of 9,000 people. And that's 9,000 people out of over 200 million people worldwide who are refugees or internally displaced people. So we take in a teeny tiny little fraction of the number of people worldwide who are in need of safety. And these are people who cannot go back to their countries of origin or they will be imprisoned, tortured, or killed. So they cannot return, they have nowhere to be, and they come in, some tiny little fraction of them is allowed to come into the United States and start their lives again. After Trump dropped that number to 9,000, the Biden administration brought it back up to a high of just around 100,000. And then a couple of days after the Trump inauguration, the program was put on pause. So right now there are 0 refugees coming in. And that is a big problem because the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program is actually run by not-for-profits that are contracted, and they are paid on a per-arrival basis. So no arrivals means no money to pay their rent or staff salaries or anything else.
One question I just wanted to ask about, just back to that kind of vetting process again. I feel like I remember you saying at some point that the refugees who are often in refugee camps for a number of years, and there's only a portion of those who are even selected to participate in a program like this. Is that true? So they've already, even before they start all of the vetting that the U.S. government does, they've already been kind of vetted. Is that true?
The United Nations certainly allows people into refugee camps without extensive vetting. But once they're there, they're generally background checked and they're a known quantity. So the United Nations only refers people it's extremely sure of to the U.S. program, and then the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program re-vets them. So they have had extensive security checking. What we do in this country is when people are admitted with refugee visas, they arrive and they have been assigned to a not-for-profit agency. Here in Indiana, it's Exodus Refugee Immigration in Bloomington and Indianapolis. Catholic Charities also resettles people. And I think Lutheran Family Services resettles people in northern Indiana. So one of these groups picks them up at the airport, gets them to an apartment where they can settle in, gets the kids enrolled in school, and helps the parents find jobs. And they have about 90 days to become economically on their feet, and they have 6 months of aid to become economically self-sufficient. So the resettlement agency will help pay rent and utilities for 6 months, but after that, they are on their own.
It's also interesting to me that it's a nonprofit group, a non-government organization that takes this on.
Historically, they have been religious groups. So they have been HIAS, which is affiliated, it's a Jewish relief organization, Lutheran Family Services, Church World Service, Catholic Charities. So this has always been involved with the United States faith community.
So to go back to talk about the food system, what kinds of jobs do refugees end up getting placed in?
Many of them are placed in these jobs in the first instance by the resettlement agency. And refugees have a particular dilemma, which is that they need jobs that are fairly high wage, that they can start immediately, and which don't require knowing English. And so that's a hard combination of things to find. And I mean, it takes out waitressing and it takes out doing retail and it takes out a lot of other occupations where you really need English skills. You need lower English skills or almost no English skills in food processing. So a lot of refugees end up doing things like meat packing, or they're working in dairy processing, making cheese, for example, or they're working in packaging food. So a lot of the organic food that you buy or sort of natural food that comes out of Colorado is packaged by refugees.
Yeah, so can you talk more about that, about those kinds of jobs and how it works?
Well, most of the work I've done has been on refugees in the meatpacking industry. And I did about a year of field work in Greeley, Colorado, where refugees from around the world are placed in Greeley by Lutheran Family Services. And Lutheran Family Services takes them to the biggest industry in this little town, which is a meatpacking plant owned by JBS, which is the world's largest meat packer. And the interesting thing is that JBS has a constant labor shortage because they have about 85% turnover of labor on the packing floor every year. 85%, because this is a very dangerous job. It is one of the most dangerous jobs in America. And people are injured very frequently, and people develop repetitive motion injuries at an astounding rate. So while the starting salaries are quite high, I think they're probably around the $27 an hour mark right now, people can't do that job for very long before they are too injured to keep working. So most of the refugees I know would start at the plant, particularly men. And the plant in Greeley has people from Burma, people from Syria, people from Afghanistan, there weren't so many Ukrainians, but there were a lot of people from Southeast Asia there. And if you look at other meatpacking plants, there are big communities of people from Cambodia and Vietnam who were placed in these industries years ago. And those people cycle among jobs. So the people I knew would work a few months at the meat packer until their bodies couldn't take it anymore. And then they would rotate over to Loprino, which is a cheesemaker. And they would work either for Loprino or for Morning Fresh Dairy for a few months until, again, their bodies started to ache. And then they would go work for Frasca Foods, which was a packaging company in Aurora, Colorado. And Frasca was a much easier job, but the wages were much, much lower. Like they were about $15 an hour as opposed to $27 an hour. So people would sort of take the Frasca job, rest up, and then when their bodies could take it again, they'd go back to the meatpacking plant. Another place people cycled to out of meatpacking was Otterbox, actually, and that was kind of manufacturing assembly. So you have this constant circulation of people whose bodies are being slowly used up over time. And they are there for a really important reason for the meatpackers, and that is that the meatpackers have consistent labor shortages. For many, many years, until about 2006, the meatpackers relied almost exclusively on undocumented workers from Mexico. And in 2006, there was a huge raid across the country by ICE. And in the Greeley plant, about 1,300 workers were arrested. Many of them were forced to sign deportation orders that they couldn't read in English. And many of these workers are not literate in any language, particularly people from Burma. And they signed these deportation orders and were deported. So those people who are deported, of course, come right back as soon as they can afford to make the crossing again. But for the meatpackers, this was a big problem. They didn't want to get raided again. So they started looking for alternative labor flows, and refugees were one of them. Another important source of labor is people who have won the green card lottery. So JBS recruits for packing plants in places like Morocco, trying to bring in people who have won the green card lottery.
Can you say just briefly what the green card lottery
is? Sure. The green card lottery is an interesting program run by the Department of State in which people who decide they would like to immigrate to the United States permanently can put their names in, and I don't know what percent of them, but it's a very small percent, actually win the chance to come to the United States and resettle, and they have legal work permission. So they come in with work permits, and then they rapidly are awarded green cards. Refugees also are assumed to be permanent residents here. They have green cards within a year of their arrival.
So they come in with work permits. Refugees do. They come in.
They are legal workers from day one. So this is this constant shifting balance in the food industry between people who are undocumented, people who are here on H-2A agricultural worker visas. Those people work in the fields. They can't work in processing. People who are here as legal refugees and people who are here as green card holders or green card winners. And these industries, particularly meat and dairy, are always trying to maintain multiple sources of labor because they are aware that the government may shut down one program or another or crack down on undocumented immigration, and then they don't have enough labor. And I will tell you that in meatpacking overall, about 45% of the workers in meatpacking are foreign-born. But that includes the accountants, the secretaries, the executives. When you go to a kill floor, everyone there is foreign-born.
And the kill floor is just where the actual meat is being processed.
It is, yes, where cattle are being killed and then being sent for further processing. I think the take-home point here is that when there is a simultaneous crackdown on undocumented immigrants and legal refugees and perhaps visa lottery winners and other forms of immigration, what happens is that there is a labor crisis in meatpacking. And when plants can't run at high speed, and they usually run at amazingly high speed, about one carcass per second, when they can't run at high speed because they have a labor shortage, you get one of two things happening. Either you have empty shelves, and that happened during the pandemic when the meatpacking plants were the centers of COVID circulation. It's a giant refrigerator. The air gets recirculated and people got sick. We saw that the shelves were bare in America in 3 days. I mean, the amount of meat that comes through the food system is very, very high. And we also find out that the price of meat skyrockets. So because you have to pay more to attract more workers. These are not jobs that native-born Americans will do. They're dangerous, they're dirty, they're incredibly hard work. So in general, you now have different industries fighting for the same pool of workers. And as that pool narrows, the price of labor goes up. And then you have to pass that down in the form of higher meat prices.
Ripple effects. Changes in immigration policy can lead to higher food prices. It's time for a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue connecting the dots in our conversation with Elizabeth Dunn, professor of geography and director of the Center for Refugee Studies at Indiana University. Stay with us. Support for Earth Eats comes from Columbus, Indiana, overflowing with everywhere art and unexpected architecture. Tickets for guided architecture tours and trip planning at columbus.in.us. Kate Young here. This is Earth Eats. Let's return to my conversation with Elizabeth Cullen Dunn, geography professor and director at the Center for Refugee Studies at Indiana University. So, my understanding is that there is a pause in the refugee admissions program in the U.S. right now, starting on January 24th.
90-day pause.
So it's a 90-day pause. And do you know if any refugees that are currently here with refugee status and legally here, are they being threatened to be sent back, or is that the ones who are already here are protected?
Right. So people who are here on legal refugee visas are right now not at any risk of deportation if they have already arrived. But there are groups that are incredibly vulnerable, and those are people who have TPS, or temporary protected status. And TPS is usually given out by the United States government in the wake of a civil war, an earthquake, economic collapse in a country. And it is meant to be temporary, but in practice, it can last a long time. So El Salvadorans, for example, have been here about 25 years, many of them. And the Trump administration has been revoking temporary protected status for some of these groups. Venezuelans, for example, just had TPR removed. One of the groups we're really worried about are Afghans. So in 2021, there was a mass evacuation after the fall of Kabul of people who had helped the United States government and whose lives were at risk. I mean, the Taliban wanted to kill them. When the United States military withdrew from Afghanistan, they left behind their retinal scanners and they left behind all the databases. So it became comparatively easy to identify people who had worked with the U.S. military as translators, as office workers, as budget planners. Many of those people were evacuated. Some were not, and they're in hiding. But those people were evacuated, about 100,000 of them, to the United States. If temporary protected status is revoked for them, where are they going to go? They cannot return to Afghanistan or they will be killed. So I have no idea what will happen if their status is revoked, but there's been lots of talk about revoking status for them.
So you said that there are people who have refugee status who end up working in meatpacking plants and dairy and a couple of other industries. But what about agriculture?
It's interesting that you mentioned dairy, so I just want to say something about dairy first. I spent some time on big commercial dairy farms in eastern Colorado when I was doing my fieldwork on meatpacking. And an overwhelming number of the people who work in dairies in America are in one of two classes of people. either they are totally undocumented or they have what are called H-2A visas. And H-2A visas are for temporary agricultural workers, and they are admitted legally to the United States, but they're tied to a labor contractor. And this is particularly significant for field labor, like farm workers in the fields, but also affects people in the dairy industry. And so they are living very isolated in small groups of people on these farms where there are sort of old mobile homes pulled up, but they're living in really dilapidated conditions. I was just shocked when I saw the way people were living in collapsing mobile homes. They were very dependent on food banks and other food security programs run by not-for-profits just to eat. Their kids were receiving some services through the public schools, but in general, not enough. So we have people in this country who are living in poverty that anyone here would find absolutely shocking. And many of them are living behind the dairies that make the milk we drink.
So the dairies can have contracts with these workers who have this particular visa, H-2A visas, but those contracts don't stipulate anything about living conditions or food provisions or anything like that.
They may not. But what's really important is that the worker is tied to the contractor.
Right.
So you can't leave legally. And if you leave, you have now overstayed your H-2A visa and you are undocumented. So right now, a colleague and I are working on submitting Freedom of Information Act requests to find out what percentage of people overstay an H-2A visa. Right now, farm workers are overwhelmingly either undocumented or on H-2A visas. And when the first Trump administration started cracking down on undocumented border crossers, they radically increased the number of H-2A visas they gave out. So in the first Trump administration, about 350,000 people from Central America or Mexico were given these H-2A visas to come in temporarily with labor contractors. And again, many of them seem to have overstayed their visa because their labor is needed. We can't pick the crops in this country without them. And so when you have people who are afraid of being tied to an unscrupulous contractor, or they're living in extremely bad conditions, being paid below minimum wage because that is legal, agricultural workers are exempt from the minimum wage standard in this country. You have people who are at real risk. And if they are undocumented or if they don't know what their official status is, and they're worried about a crackdown, they will stop coming to work. And when that happens, you have a very narrow window to pick those crops. If strawberries are ripe, you can't wait 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month. They're ripe now. And if we don't have people in the fields to pick them, then the fruit rots on the ground. And whatever fruit they can get out with whoever will show up to work, the price on that skyrockets.
So you're saying that when someone comes in on an H-2A visa, they have a limited amount of time and they have a contract with an industry, with a business owner.
Yeah, the contractor is not the farmer, right? So there's a contracting agency that can move these people from farm to farm, field to field. But that means that it is unlikely that anyone is tracking them. It is unlikely that anyone is making sure that they have reasonable housing standards, that their kids are being educated, that babies are being vaccinated. So these are incredibly vulnerable people who are trying to make some sort of a living, usually because they cannot stay in the country they came from. Very often that's because of violence. In Mexico, it's gang violence. Throughout Central America, we have what are euphemistically called non-state actors, but that is basically cartels and gangs that are militarized and that are terrorizing people.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what are some of the places where these H-2A visa holders are placed? Like, is it mostly in California or in the areas where there's kind of year-round growing, or is it throughout the United States?
It's throughout the United States. Of course, many of them are migrant farm workers, meaning they're following the crop from south to north because as strawberries come into season, they start in California and they work their way up to Washington. But there are migrant farm workers all over the United States. Any place that is growing anything probably has some proportion of H-2A visa holders and undocumented people working in the food system. I think the take-home point here is that if we don't have immigrants of various statuses working in the food system in this country will collapse. The food system in America is entirely dependent on migrants. We can talk about the processes, legal and not so legal, that bring them to this country. And we can talk about how difficult it is for people to come to this country legally. But the truth is that the entire food system, from crops in the ground to cows being milked, to cows being slaughtered for beef, to pork, everything we eat basically depends on immigrant labor.
Do you have any sense of what the plan is then?
I do not have any sense that there is a plan for staffing the United States agricultural system in any legal way. I hear a lot of people say, I'm fine with immigration as long as they come the right way, as long as they come the legal way. And I think all of us want people to come with legal visas because those visas protect them and they give them some autonomy and they give them some freedom from fear. And they also help farmers who need this labor and who themselves actually probably would like to have legal workers. Undocumented workers are cheaper, but the risk level is higher. So people who are here on various forms of visas are an important labor source. We all want people to come legally and in a documented sense. But right now we have an immigration system that itself is collapsing. So if you are a forced migrant, let's just say for a second that you have been forced out of your home by a gang in southern Mexico. And they're telling you have to pay them $10,000 or they're going to kill your kids. So you run. Those people, if they come to the U.S. border and ask for asylum, which is their legal right under American law, what they should get is what's called a credible fear hearing. And then if it is judged that they do have a credible fear of persecution, they're admitted to the United States and they can request asylum. That process is 100% legal. It is in American law. But right now, the immigration system is so overwhelmed, so backlogged, and so short-staffed that an asylum hearing can take more than 7 years to get. And so people who need to come, who have to come, or they will be killed, are having to come without documentation because it is the only way that they can find safety for their families. And I am one of the people who believes we have an obligation to these people under international law. The United States is not a signatory to the 1951 UN Protocol on the Status of Refugees, but interestingly, we are a signatory to the 1967 addendum to that. So that's why we have a process for admitting people. The 1980 refugee law also specifies how people can seek asylum in this country and seek refugee status. You get refugee status if you get it from outside the country, asylum if you present yourself at a border or you're inside the country on another visa status. And we all want that system to work. We need these people here. We need their labor to feed us. And we all want them to come in a proper and documented way. But right now, because there's so little investment in immigration courts and the immigration system, it's impossible for most people to use that process. So they're forced to come undocumented.
For people who want to reduce or end the immigration into the U.S., a lot of times they're claiming, they're taking your jobs, they're taking your housing. They're taking away housing from U.S. citizens. The housing, I know, probably isn't your specialty, but what would you say about they're taking your jobs?
Well, I always joke about Schrodinger's refugee, right? Too lazy to work, but still taking your job. And people say both things about them, right? They're freeloading on the system, but they're simultaneously stealing jobs. The truth is that most of these people are working in jobs that Americans will not take. Our unemployment rate has been so low for so many years that most Americans will not take these back-breaking jobs. I mean, can you imagine stooping over to pick strawberries in the hot sun 12 hours a day, 7 days a week? That's what people are doing, and Americans won't take these jobs. And programs to get American citizens to take these jobs have been resounding failures.
And it's not just bending over in fields. It's the kind of grueling, dangerous, and frankly, disgusting jobs of working in meatpacking.
Yeah, I mean, there are very few people who are willing to work in 40-degree temperatures because a meatpacking plant is a giant refrigerator. So the temperatures are very, very cold, and people are working where they are being spattered with blood, very often spattered with cow feces. They are doing jobs that are very dangerous. We worked with a man who had lost his arm. We worked with a man who had lost a finger. During my stay on the meatpacking project, a man was swept by a swinging piece of machinery, knocked into a vat that was being used to tan cow hides, and he died. I mean, that's acid. So these kinds of injuries happen on a very regular basis, and most Americans will not do that work, even for $27 an hour. So our choices at this point are to find ways to bring people in an orderly legal process, or to tolerate undocumented labor, or to not have that food on our tables. Those are the choices.
Or to have it at such a high price that only the elite can afford it.
Yes, or to have it at such a high price that only extremely wealthy people can afford it. And that's not tolerable to the American consumer. So I think we need to talk about the ways that the United States food system is dependent on immigrants for labor. And we need to talk about the systems that we have for bringing them here. But shutting down the refugee resettlement program, or cracking down on undocumented labor, or trying to route people to H-2A visas that then expire and then people overstay and they are undocumented again. None of these are long-term sustainable answers to our labor problem in the food system.
I'm speaking with Elizabeth Cullen Dunn, geography professor and director of the Center for Refugee Studies at Indiana University. We'll return to our conversation after a quick break. Stay with us. Support for Earth Eats comes from Columbus, Indiana, overflowing with everywhere art and unexpected architecture. Tickets for guided architecture tours and trip planning at columbus.in.us. We're back. This is Earth Eats. I'm Kate Young, and I'm speaking with Elizabeth Cullen Dunn, geographer and director of the Center for Refugee Studies at Indiana University. Though we touched on it earlier, I asked Elizabeth to elaborate on how she thought the Trump administration's pause on refugee admissions would affect our food system.
Yeah, the pause in refugee admissions is a fairly small proportion of immigrants in the food system. So it's at its peak 100,000 people a year. It will cause problems for industries like dairy and meatpacking if it happens at the same time that there is a crackdown on undocumented people coming in, or if there's also a reduction in the number of H-2A visas. And there have been times when all three of those things are happening simultaneously. That happened in the first Trump administration. And then we had real problems staffing meatpacking plants and dairies. We had real problems getting people to pick crops in the field. So the question is, I think there are two questions. One is, how do different industries in the food system shift among different kinds of workers on different statuses in order to maintain the labor that they need? And that's one of the questions that Dr. Shea Frydenlund and I have been working on. But the other question is, what happens when all of those labor streams are shut down simultaneously? And that is going to be a very complicated problem if that happens.
I also just wanted to clarify something. Could you explain the difference between a refugee status and asylum status?
That is a very complicated question, but let me try again. So people who come on refugee visas apply from a second country. So, for example, if you were a Syrian and you left Syria because your life was in danger, and we now know that hundreds of thousands of people were tortured in prisons there, for example, or hit with barrel bombs, and you fled to Turkey, you could apply through the United Nations to be resettled in a third country, and you might be resettled in the United States. For Syrians, it's actually a very small number, but this is true, for example, Congolese people who are in camps in Uganda, or Rwandans who are in camps in Uganda. We have lots of people coming in from Myanmar, which used to be Burma, which is now under a military junta. Some of those people, I worked with Rohingya people who were ethnically cleansed and their villages were set on fire, and they were forced into Bangladesh. So there are over 1 million Rohingya people in Bangladesh, and some of them are being resettled in the United States. So all of those people are going through a complex legal process that is mediated by the United Nations and the United States Department of State. That's refugee status. You apply from outside the country, and you have to be basically granted refugee status by the United Nations first. Asylum is something that you can apply for if you are either at a United States port of entry, meaning at the border, or you are inside the United States already, and you apply for asylum because you are in fear of your life if you return to your country of origin. So I testify in a lot of these asylum cases related to countries that I know very well. And these are people very often who came in on tourist visas. They came in on agricultural worker visas. They came in undocumented. They are afraid to return, so they apply for asylum.
Before the 2024 election, and it was in fact during a presidential debate, then candidate Trump made this alarming accusation about Haitian immigrants stealing pets and eating them in Springfield, Ohio. And the claim turned out to be completely false and baseless, and J.D. Vance all but admitted to fabricating it. But I bring it up because I feel like it highlights the weaponization of otherness that perhaps this administration is engaging in. And in this case, it was around food. It felt like these people are strange. They're so strange, they might eat cats and dogs. In fact, they might be stealing pets.
I think you could say that during the 2024 campaign, there was a lot of discussion about immigrants to the United States eating strange things, including people's household pets. And that claim was really about making people seem foreign and dangerous because of their foodways and their culture. So I think that is a very, very old story. You know, one of the interesting things I ran into when I was doing some research on the school lunch program in America is that the school lunch program was started, or the justification for it was that Italian immigrant children in the tenements were starving because all they ate was pasta. And you see these pictures of these sort of plump, rosy-cheeked kids who were eating a perfectly fine Italian diet, but who were deemed to be starving because they were not eating a Northern European diet like previous rounds of immigrants to the United States. So we have a long history of demonizing people because we demonize their foodways. Most of the Haitians that were here, by the way, are on temporary protected status. So many of them came because of the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. Many others came because of the recent collapse of the Haitian government. And in Indiana, we have Haitians here because they work in a Tyson meatpacking plant in northern Indiana. We also actually surprisingly have a growing number of people from Myanmar in Fort Wayne for the same reason. They work at a pork processing plant. So Haitian people do not eat dogs and cats. This is a story that is 200 years old. But I think the point is to make them seem both other and threatening. So it doesn't surprise me at all that that story was circulating, because people's foodways have been a way of making them outsiders for generations.
I just had wanted to bring it up because it did actually deal with food, even though it could have been, they could have chosen something else, but they chose food.
But if you listen to talk that is anti-immigration, you will hear lots about food. You will hear lots of stories about people's children being undernourished or improperly nourished because those immigrants don't know enough to feed them properly. You'll hear lots of stories about immigrants and their food smelling bad and causing some kind of smell pollution. You'll hear lots of stories about immigrants eating food that's unacceptable. And that has been said about Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, immigrants from Italy, immigrants from Poland. That has been said about every immigrant group since forever. You know, I find it totally unsurprising.
And so many personal immigration stories that I hear have to do with the lunchroom and bringing food from home and
that smells funny.
At school, the lunchroom at school, bringing food from home that smells funny, and the shame that develops around that. And
I think that that's an age-old immigration story. One of the stories I remember about that was told by a man whose grandmother was an Italian immigrant, and so she was packing his lunch and putting homemade biscotti in it. Biscotti, so yummy. But he felt an enormous amount of shame and wanted Oreos. If I had to choose, man, biscotti would win every time. But I think that is a story as old as immigration.
The Center for Refugee Studies sent out a document that really just listed some facts about what refugees contribute to the American economy or to our...
Yeah, we sent out an infographic that talked about what refugees, this is people who are part of the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, contribute to the American economy. And I think it's really important to note that people who come here as refugees pay taxes and they buy things, right? So they are important sources of income for other people in the economy. So one of the things we found out is that by the 6th year after arrival, adult refugees of working age are employed at higher rates than native-born citizens. If refugees are capable of working, they go to work. So they aren't sitting around leeching off of public services. They're working and they're contributing to our economy. On average, refugees pay $21,000 more in taxes than they receive in public benefits. So they are a net contributor to the American economy, to the American taxation system and the American government. They give more than they take. And we know that in 2019, refugees contributed over $25 billion in taxes. They earned $93.6 billion in household income. This is total of all refugees that have been admitted. And they resulted in $68.6 billion in disposable income available for U.S. businesses. They spend money. When you arrive in a country with nothing, you take the money that you earn and you spend it in the local economy. And that's really important in places like Indiana, because in many small towns, these refugee communities are keeping those small town businesses alive. And if in a place like Springfield, Ohio, they lose all the Haitian immigrants, the restaurants, the shops, the movie theaters in that town will go out of business.
I think it's important to share that kind of information because I think most Americans are not aware of that. When we think of refugees coming from another country, we think they need help and we're being nice and we're helping them.
That it's a humanitarian project.
Exactly.
It is an economic project, and we bring them here because we need their work. And we need them to contribute to the economy. That's always been the story of America, right? Every successive wave of immigrants enters into low-wage jobs that the other people won't take, and they work their way up the chain. I was rereading The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which was published, I think, in 1906. And what was amazing to me is if you had taken all the Lithuanian names out of that story and moved it from Chicago to Greeley, Colorado, and put in Rohingya people, you would have the same story. The plot is the same, right? It's just a story that repeats and repeats and repeats. So I think we need to think about the important role that these people play in providing our food, and we need to think about making sure that they have decent conditions of living because they contribute to the economy. If you like eating, you should be in favor of refugee resettlement and other forms of food-related immigration.
Thank you so much for talking with me today, Elizabeth Dunn. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
That was Elizabeth Cullen Dunn, geography professor and director of the Center for Refugee Studies at Indiana University. We have links to her work and also to previous conversations we've had with Professor Dunn on Earth Eats about the role of refugees and migrants in our food system here in the U.S., as well as food stories of displaced people in Georgia and Ukraine. Find that at eartheats.org. That's it for our show this week. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. The Earth Eats team includes Eoban Binder, Alexis Carvajal, Alex Chambers, Toby Foster, Leo Pies, Daniela Richardson, Samantha Schimenauer, Peyton Whaley, and we partner with Harvest Public Media. Special thanks this week to Elizabeth Cullen Dunn. Earth Eats is produced and edited by me, Kate Young. Our theme music is composed by Aaron Toby and performed by Aaron and Matt Toby. Additional music on the show comes to us from Universal Production Music. Our executive producer is Eric Bolstridge.
Hoosier Spirits is a new documentary from WTIU and Indiana Public Media that explores Indiana's deep distilling roots and visits distilleries across the state to get a glimpse at the future of Hoosier Spirits. Learn more, check out a map of Indiana distilleries, and get the recipe for our exclusive cocktail at WTIU.org/Hoosier Spirits.